You have to help me find a husband." Those were the words that stopped Elias Vane cold in the middle of a conference room on the 31st floor. The city sprawled silver and gray beyond the glass behind him. He had heard his boss say 100 impossible things before, in 100 different crises, calm sentences that had once dismantled hostile takeovers and silenced furious investors without raising her voice. But he had never heard anything like this. Vivienne Marlowe was not a woman who asked for help, and she was certainly not a woman who talked about husbands between quarterly reports and closing numbers. Yet there she stood, arms crossed, composure fully intact, sliding a folder across the polished table, like it was just another proposal waiting for his signature. He was a single father. A quiet man who had spent years standing just behind her success. Never in front of it. Never asking for credit he had more than earned. He had built spreadsheets at midnight, while the rest of the building slept, smoothed over disasters before she ever learned they existed, and said almost nothing about his own life in return. Never once had he imagined that his next assignment would be arranging the marriage of the one woman he had spent 3 years trying, and failing, not to love. Vivienne opened the folder and turned it toward him, and inside were photographs, resumes, net worth summaries, a lineup of men who looked as though they had been assembled in a laboratory, built for the sole purpose of perfection. Elias began scheduling the appointments anyway, because refusing her had never once been a real option in the 3 years he had known her. He picked the restaurants with private corners and quiet music. He chose the words she should say, and the ones she should never let slip. He helped her decide which dress caught the light without trying too hard, and which one said exactly enough without saying too much. Night after night, he sat across from her at that same long table, building a stranger's future out of napkins and reservation slips, telling himself over and over that none of it meant anything at all. Then one evening, long after the office had emptied and the city outside had gone quiet enough to hear the hum of the air conditioning, Vivienne looked at him for a long moment before she finally spoke. "Elias," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it inside these walls. "Why do I keep feeling like the man I'm searching for has been standing in front of me the entire time?" He didn't answer. He didn't know how. And the silence between them stretched long enough that both of them understood exactly what it meant. Elias Vane was 39 years old, and fatherhood had shaped him long before anyone at Marlowe Meridian ever learned his name or his history. He never brought that part of his life into the office, never let it surface in meetings or hallway conversations, yet it lived quietly in everything he did and the responsibility he carried like a second skeleton beneath his suit. In the careful way he weighed every choice before committing to it, in the patience that made him nearly impossible to rattle no matter how loud the room around him became. He held the title of Executive Director of Strategy, technically several rungs below the woman who ran the entire company, though anyone watching them work together for more than a single week would have struggled to say with certainty who actually led whom. He was not the richest man at Marlowe Meridian, and everyone in the building knew it. He was not the loudest voice in any meeting, certainly not the one photographed at galas or profiled in glossy business magazines beside champagne flutes and skyline views. But when a genuine crisis broke a deal collapsing at 2 in the morning, a reporter circling with the wrong question, a board member threatening to walk out and take his capital with him, Vivienne never called legal first, and she never called the chief financial officer. She called Elias every single time, without fail, as though it had never occurred to her to call anyone else first. Somewhere along the way, without either of them ever naming it out loud, the two of them had built an understanding that felt less like a working relationship and more like a private language only they spoke fluently. Vivienne trusted him completely, in a way she had learned, painfully, not to trust anyone else in that building or outside it. Elias understood her in ways that unsettled him whenever he let himself think about it too long, so mostly he simply didn't. Both of them had quietly agreed, without ever discussing it directly, to call whatever existed between them professionalism. It was a convenient word, borrowed and worn thin from overuse. It asked nothing of either of them, and it explained away everything that might otherwise have demanded a harder conversation. Vivian had failed at love before, publicly and painfully, in a marriage-shaped disappointment that the tabloids had picked apart for months. The experience had left her with a theory she rarely spoke aloud, but lived by anyway. A quiet certainty that any man who approached her wanted her money, her name, or the reflected shine of her power. Every date felt like an audition for someone else's ambitions, dressed up as romance. Every compliment arrived wrapped around a hidden agenda she had trained herself to detect within the first 10 minutes of any conversation. Elias had never once been like that, and it was the reason she had let him closer than she had let anyone in years, without even realizing it was happening. He never flattered her, never angled for her attention, never seemed to want anything from her at all beyond doing his job well. He simply appeared exactly when she needed him, solved whatever had gone wrong with a calm that steadied the entire room, and then disappeared again before she could properly thank him. It was, in its own strange and understated way, the most intimate thing anyone had ever done for her, and she had spent years refusing to notice how deeply it had settled into her. The afternoon everything shifted began like any other Tuesday. A negotiation had turned hostile without warning. A longtime partner had walked out threatening to pull his capital entirely. And by the time the room emptied, Vivienne looked more exhausted than Elias had ever seen her look in 3 years of watching her carefully. She waited until the last assistant had gathered their tablets and left before she spoke. "Elias," she said, "I want you to help me find a husband." He thought, for one absurd second, that he had simply misheard her, that exhaustion had bent her words into something they couldn't possibly be. Then she placed the folder squarely in front of him, and he understood she had never in her life been more serious about anything. Elias didn't want the assignment, and he told her so as plainly as he dared, standing there with the folder untouched between them. But Vivienne explained the pressure building around her with the flat, tired honesty of someone who had already argued herself out of every alternative available. The board believed a single female chief executive, unattached and unaccountable to anyone but herself, made the company appear unstable to investors who valued predictability far more than they valued talent. She didn't need love, she told him, her voice hardening slightly around the word. She needed a man polished enough to make the whispers finally stop. He agreed to help her, and it wasn't for the money, because money had never meant anything to him beyond what it could provide his daughter. It was because he understood Vivienne better than anyone else in her life, and some stubborn, protective part of him believed that if this arrangement had to happen at all, it should at least happen in hands that wouldn't hurt her. The folder contained 3 names that rose immediately above the rest. Damian Cross was a wealthy investor, with a reputation for charm as polished and deliberate as his tailored shoes. Lucien Hartwell was a celebrated attorney from a family that had held power for 3 generations before he was ever born into it. Soren Whitaker was a young chief executive whose company had tripled in value within 18 months, a man the business press had already started calling inevitable, as though his success were less a choice than a certainty. Elias studied each file the way he studied acquisition targets, breaking down strengths, weaknesses, hidden variables, risks buried beneath polished exteriors. Vivienne watched him work with something close to amusement and finally laughed, a real laugh, the kind she rarely allowed herself inside these walls. "Are you hiring me a husband or a chief financial officer?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. He didn't look up from the page in front of him. "With you," he said, "I'm honestly not sure those 2 jobs are very different." It was the first time in weeks she had laughed like she genuinely meant it, and something tightened uncomfortably in Elias's chest at the sound. Over the following days, Vivienne began noticing things about Elias that she had somehow filed away as unimportant for 3 entire years. He knew she hated restaurants where the music drowned out every conversation before it started. He knew she found red roses predictable to the point of quiet insult. He knew exactly how she took her coffee without ever having to ask twice. And he knew, more than anything else, precisely when she needed silence instead of solutions. Neither of them said a single word about what any of it might mean. They simply kept working, kept pretending everything was ordinary, kept ignoring the quiet current running steadily beneath every conversation they had. One evening, as Elias organized the calendar of upcoming introductions, Vivienne asked him directly which man on the list he thought she should choose. He looked at the 3 folders spread across the table, then looked at her for a long,